Nestled along the Sierra Nevada mountains near the south entrance of Yosemite National Park sits the small mountain town of Oakhurst, California. Originally called Fresno Flats, Oakhurst has had a colorful past, and as a major town situated at the southern starting point of the famed Highway 49, it has seen some interesting characters over the years. However, this generally quiet town also has a darker side. Indian tales and local lore speak of a monstrous hair-covered man-like creature that is said to roam the nearby forests in the dead of night. A creature with glowing red eyes and a blood-curdling scream. A creature that some believe will snatch your children if they wander too far into the woods. A creature I strongly believe I encountered on March 3rd, 2020. And I have once again returned to that location of my encounter with the hopes of finding this creature and capturing it on camera. Hello and welcome to Squatchspot. I'm Darrin Smith, and I want to thank all of you for your continued support of my channel and for your encouragement. It is truly the support that I am getting from all of you that keeps me motivated to continue my efforts and to be sharing my findings here on YouTube. So I absolutely want to send out a big thank you to all of you for that. And I also want to thank all of you who joined me for the premiere of my last video. I found that the premiering of a video was a very fun and unique experience. There was a chat room that was available for us to interact with one another on a much more personal level, and I definitely think I will be premiering many more videos in the future just because it really did give us a nice way to connect on a more personal level. So I definitely encourage you to keep an eye out for those. Now, I'm happy to report that here in the California Sierra Nevada mountains in the area where I live, it seems like there is a light at the end of the tunnel when dealing with this COVID-19 crisis. And I'm happy to see that a lot of the businesses that have been shut down for this past year are starting to reopen, including the local movie theater, which is now showing movies once again. So it is very exciting to see that there is some sort of normalcy and that there is some light at the end of the tunnel. But all that being said, I definitely encourage everybody to maintain a sense of cautiousness and to definitely not let down your guard and to continue to practice safe protocols when dealing with this crisis, because I definitely don't want us to be having a relapse and going back into those strict lockdown situations. So I definitely encourage all of you to maintain a sense of cautiousness, but it is nice to see that there is some light at the end of the tunnel, and I'm very excited to see that there is some sort of normalcy returning to this world of ours. Now, today I am back out at my encounter location from March 3rd, 2020. As I mentioned on previous videos, I would definitely be keeping this area under surveillance and be monitoring it closely. However, I am surprised to see coming up into the area that a lot of that snow that was here during our last visit has melted off. And as I mentioned numerous times on previous videos, it is my belief that the Sasquatch tend to hang out just below the snow line. And when that snow melts off, they move up to the higher elevations for the warmer summer months. And so I do think that it is probably that time of year when the Sasquatch will be doing their seasonal migration. So I'm not so sure that they will be in the area while we are here today, but I definitely think that we should spend the day just investigating the environment to see if we can find any sort of physical evidence that the Sasquatch are still at these lower elevations. I've mentioned this a number of times, but around this area where I discovered the Sasquatch nest, there's this bush here that is apparently called buckbrush, and it has these needle-sharp thorns on it. And what I found very intriguing was the Sasquatch nest was completely surrounded by this stuff. And if you could see, I am just shy of 6 feet 4 inches, and so you can see this stuff grows incredibly tall. In fact, I think it can grow up to 10 feet. And that whole nest site was completely surrounded by this. And I mentioned I looked on Google Earth and I could see that it went in considerable distance completely around that environment. And I think it's amazing that the Sasquatch would utilize this barrier, this bush with these incredibly sharp thorns on it, to create an element of safety around them. And I did mention that there were 2 places where the brush had been cleared out, where the Sasquatch could enter that nest site. And there was also that log, the tree fall that had come down and was laying on top of a lot of this brush, so it created an easy escape route out of that nest site area. So I think it's really amazing that the Sasquatch would have the intelligence to intentionally put their nest in an environment that is protected by this brush. I've created this rough representation of the nest site area to give you all a better understanding of the environment and what transpired during my encounter and the follow-up investigations. The light green areas represent the buckbrush that was growing in the area. The brush was incredibly thick with needle-sharp thorns, and it created an absolute impenetrable wall around the nest site. With the exception of the areas I've mentioned previously, where I found the brush had been groomed in a way that created 2 distinct pathways into the nest. The Sasquatch was hiding in the brush near one of these entrances. As I moved into the area, I encountered a tree cluster and heavy brush to my right, where the Sasquatch was hiding. I could not see well into the vegetation, and I thought it was best to stay away from heavy brush and to remain in open spaces, since I did not know exactly where the Sasquatch was located, only that I was in very close proximity to it, and the screeching bird I was hearing in the tree cluster was emphasizing this belief. To give you a comparison, this is what the tree cluster area looked like when I returned to the area following my encounter to conduct an investigation. You can clearly see through the vegetation for quite a distance. This is what that same area looked like when I approached it during my initial encounter. Although the sunlight intensity and angling is similar, clearly there is a dramatic difference between shots. Though I don't necessarily agree, there are some researchers who believe the Sasquatch has the ability to manipulate environmental energies to create perceptual shielding or cloaking. And although I may not embrace these ideas, I did find the differences in the environment shocking. With the mindset of staying away from that tree cluster and that heavy brush, I ended up pulling to my left towards an open-up area, and where I began using the parabolic microphone in an attempt to pinpoint the Sasquatch's location. While using the microphone, I quickly came to the conclusion the Sasquatch was in very close proximity to me, and likely hiding in the brush to my right. So I decided my best approach was to continue moving to my left into that opened-out clearing, and try to find another vantage point that would offer me a better visual, yet keep me away from that heavy brush. Which is when I discovered the cleared-out entranceway that led into the nest area. However, as I approached this area, I was overcome with an irrational, overwhelming sense of terror, a terror that encouraged me to leave the area. Returning to the location days later, I began an investigation of the area, and I discovered the nest site, where I found multiple hair samples that have been analyzed using a very high-powered microscope. The hair samples did not match any known animal. They were lacking a medulla, which is a primary characteristic of Sasquatch hair, and the analysis concluded these hairs were very likely from a Sasquatch, adding substantial credibility that I have, in fact, discovered a Sasquatch nest. I also discovered multiple footprint-shaped impressions in the area and noted the groomed vegetation, which gave easy access to the nest. And just behind where the Sasquatch was hiding in the brush, I discovered an area within the tree cluster and thick vegetation where it appeared the typical forest debris and low-hanging tree branches had been cleared out, which created a nice open space within the brush. It was situated up against a very large log, which was an ideal windbreak and created a sense of safety and seclusion. The space looked like a perfect bedding area. When I initially arrived into this location on March 3, 2020, the Sasquatch at the top of the embankment let out an unmistakable high-pitched Sasquatch shriek. I quickly got out of my vehicle and began recording the sounds I was hearing on the embankment using my parabolic microphone, which included this guttural primate sound followed by tree knocking, or perhaps chest slapping, and a loud primate huff. Oftentimes when primates exhibit this sort of behavior, they are trying to show strength and power in an attempt to intimidate and chase an opposing threat from their territory. However, I held my ground, and when I heard the Sasquatch moving off, I grabbed my gear and used my parabolic microphone to follow the Sasquatch into the woods. Also, during the initial encounter, as I was trying to pinpoint the Sasquatch's location using the parabolic microphone as I stood near that heavy brush, my audio equipment picked up some very unusual tapping sounds coming from the direction where the Sasquatch was hiding. I did not initially hear these sounds, as I had already switched off the parabolic microphone. However, I was still wearing the headphones. Was the Sasquatch attempting to make contact with me? Or was it covertly communicating with another Sasquatch in the area? There was another tapping sound captured on the recorder that did sound as if it had come from a different location, though it is not certain. And if the Sasquatch was trying to be covert, why would it create sharp, notable sounds? There are many within the Bigfoot community who believe the Sasquatch do make these soft tapping sounds in an attempt to communicate. Based on the evidence gathered during my initial encounter with the Sasquatch and the subsequent investigations, there are some intriguing possibilities that have raised a lot of discussion. The initial vocalization I heard as I pulled into the area was very likely an alert for the other Sasquatch in the area of an opposing threat. Sasquatch generally travel in small family groups, and as this was a nest site location, it is very likely there were other Sasquatch in the area, and the audio recordings of the tapping sounds heard does support this theory that there were more than one Sasquatch in the area. The primate guttural sounds and knocking and huff were likely an attempt to chase me out of the area, and when it failed, the Sasquatch retreated as they often do when encountering humans. There is a lot of discussion regarding the possible motives of the Sasquatch to head in the direction of the nest site and hide in the brush. Some speculate that the Sasquatch was trying to lure me into an ambush, and to be honest, the thought had crossed my mind. However, it is unclear if the Sasquatch knew I was following it after it retreated from the embankment. I was using a very sensitive microphone to track the movement of the Sasquatch, and as I've mentioned on several other videos, as I followed the Sasquatch through the woods, I was at a considerable distance away from it. However, I could hear that the Sasquatch would stop moving for a bit and pause before continuing. This movement pattern could indicate the Sasquatch was pausing to ascertain whether or not it was being followed as it fled into the woods. Also, the fact that the Sasquatch fled towards the nest site and was hiding in the brush near that protected bedding area suggests it was trying to retreat to a location where it felt safe. If its intentions were to cause harm to me, I do not believe it would have left the hillside embankment where I first encountered it, and I absolutely do not believe the Sasquatch would have led me to the nest site. In fact, I think if it was being strategic, it would have led me away from it. Also, the Sasquatch had plenty of opportunities to attack me once I arrived at that heavy brush near the nest. I was less than 10 yards from the Sasquatch, and I did not know its location. However, it did not. And as I mentioned, it was very likely there were more Sasquatch in the area. And there is a strong possibility that the tapping sounds the Sasquatch was making was an attempt to communicate with me. The incapacitating fear I experienced as I tried to move into that nest area is a commonly reported happening during Sasquatch encounters. There's a lot of researchers who believe the Sasquatch have the ability to use infrasounds, low-frequency vibrations that can produce heightened anxiety states in humans, and it is thought the Sasquatch used these infrasounds to chase away intruders. And although there are researchers out there who would promote the Sasquatch are aggressive, bloodthirsty monsters, I do not share this opinion. There are literally thousands of reported Sasquatch encounters, and the large majority of them report very passive, non-aggressive incidents, with the Sasquatch usually fleeing into the woods. And the experience I had on March 3rd, 2020 was yet another example of this typical non-confrontational retreat behavior. Is that to say I do not believe the Sasquatch are dangerous? No. These are wild and unpredictable creatures, and their size and strength would automatically place them in a dangerous category. And I will say there are some unpleasant incidents that have occurred that I do believe the Sasquatch were involved in. However, I really do think these cases are in the minority, and the Sasquatch are generally not the monsters some portray them to be. On the last episode, as we were moving into this environment, I mentioned I didn't want to go all the way to the nest site that I discovered in March of 2020 for fear of contaminating that environment if I hadn't already done so on my initial investigation of that area. And I think it's very important for researchers to kind of keep that in mind when they are focusing their efforts in a particular location, to understand that their presence in that environment is going to create discomfort for the Sasquatch. And if you spend too much time in that environment, I think it is just going to encourage the Sasquatch to relocate. And if you are concerned about contaminating your research area absolutely do not set up a game camera. For whatever reason, the Sasquatch have identified the game cameras as being a personal threat to them, and I find this very intriguing because it is well documented that the Sasquatch have no problem approaching our stuff. They will often be spotted up on our porches, up around our homes. They will shake our vehicles that are parked along desolate mountain roads, and they will even come into our campsites in the dead of night and poke around our camping equipment. So it is definitely well documented that the Sasquatch don't seem to have any concern when approaching our stuff. However, the game cameras, they have learned to absolutely avoid at all costs. And I think this is very intriguing because there are literally hundreds of cameras across the United States monitoring the forest. However, we are not getting any photographs of Sasquatch. And there are some theories as to why this may be. First, the Sasquatch could be identifying the cameras based on something they're hearing, smelling, or they may even be seeing some sort of illumination that the camera is putting off the various sensors there. So I can absolutely understand how the Sasquatch are becoming aware of the cameras as they are moving through an environment. However, I do think it's very interesting that they know to stay away from the cameras. And there's one idea that the Sasquatch may have identified these game cameras as being something associated with hunters, and they would be well in tune to the dangers that hunters would pose. So if they had made that connection that the cameras are associated with hunters, that would explain why they would avoid them. However, I really have a hard time believing that this would explain all the avoidance that is occurring across the United States. When you're setting up game cameras, if you are worried about contaminating the environment, try concealing or camouflaging the camera. One approach that has produced results is to place the camera in a cooler or ice chest and set the chest a little ways from your camp, in an area that has tree or brush cover. Sasquatch often approach our camps and will poke around our equipment, and it has been noted they will oftentimes open our coolers, and this camera trap offers an excellent way to conceal the game camera and gives researchers a great opportunity to capture a very good close-up headshot of a Sasquatch. So I didn't head down into the nest site. However, based on my investigation of the area today and the outcome of a few experiments I was running since our last visit to this location, I am convinced the Sasquatch are not in the area, and there's no evidence that leads me to believe that they've been in this area recently. So that very much concerns me because I'm concerned that I may have contaminated the environment when I discovered their nest site in March 2020, at which point they abandoned this area. And that's very disappointing because I was considering this area an active Sasquatch research location. But based on my investigation, it is clear the Sasquatch are no longer here and that they've either abandoned this nest site and this area, or they have already begun their seasonal migration up to those higher elevations. And either way, the strategy for our investigation would be the same, and that would be to start investigating areas higher up on the mountain and higher up on this ridge line, and eventually get up to those higher elevations where the Sasquatch will be residing. However, I have mentioned numerous times on previous episode that once the Sasquatch begin their seasonal migration, and once they are moving up to those higher elevations, it's going to be very difficult for us to pinpoint their location and for us to keep up with them. However, once they get up to those higher elevations, and here in the California Sierra Nevada mountains, those elevations are usually above 8,000 feet. So once they get up to those locations, they will be remaining in those areas for a length of time throughout the summer months. And so that will give us an opportunity to encounter them once we get up to those higher locations. I mentioned I had conducted a number of experiments since my last visit to this area, And although I won't elaborate on what approaches I took, I will share a number of approaches researchers have taken in the past to try and ascertain whether or not a Sasquatch is in an area. One noted approach is the use of game cameras. However, as I mentioned, poorly placed game cameras will contaminate a research area and will only encourage the Sasquatch to leave the area. I've also mentioned on previous videos, gifting stations are a popular approach, where researchers will arrange an assortment of items in a strategic location to try to entice a Sasquatch. However, the items placed at the gifting station should be well thought out, because raccoons and ravens are notorious gifting station bandits. Another approach is raking. The idea here is you clear out the forest debris from an area and you manipulate the soil to produce a medium that is conducive at capturing clear footprint impressions, and you create some sort of lure for the Sasquatch. Or you prepare the track trap in an area where you anticipate the Sasquatch would be moving through. Some researchers use a special UV fluorescent powder that is excellent at identifying animals and their movement patterns. The spider web is an approach that uses fine thread that is strung at a height and location conducive for Sasquatch. The idea here is if the Sasquatch moves through the area, it will break the thread. However, again, birds must be considered as the likely trigger. Sticky traps are another approach researchers have taken. There are a number of products on the market that could be used for this approach. These traps, like fly paper, are placed in a location the Sasquatch are likely to venture, and the hopes is the Sasquatch will bump into one of these traps as it moves through the forest, and hair will be captured on the adhesive. I'm not fond of this approach. Though effective, these adhesive traps pose a risk to the environment I find unacceptable. Use extreme caution if utilizing this approach to minimize the environmental impact. These are just a few approaches researchers have taken to try to gather physical evidence that the Sasquatch are in an area. Personally, I am not fond of any approach that have a considerable environmental impact, and I am firm in my stance that if you do conduct any field research, you make sure to pack out everything you brought into the wilds. Like Sasquatch, leave no trace. I also make it a point to bring a trash bag with me as I head into the field, and I will collect the garbage I discover in the forest. I pack out what others have left behind. These wildlands are an absolute blessed haven, featuring an abundance of pristine beauty, and are home to an amazing array of life, and I feel they should be nurtured and respected. I've moved up to a higher elevation up along this ridge, and I love investigating these marshy areas where you have this grassland and this snow that is melting off, because it makes the perfect medium for which to find footprint impressions. I spent the remainder of the day investigating areas I have been monitoring at higher elevations along this ridge. The roads leading into these areas were still heavily covered with debris and snow, which made it difficult to access these areas. With the Sasquatch on the move, it is going to be very difficult for us to pinpoint their location and to keep up with them as they make their seasonal migration. However, I am going to continue my efforts. I'll also be venturing back into that nest site location in the near future to see if I can ascertain if the Sasquatch had utilized that nest during the past season. And I am also making plans to get up to those much higher elevations to try and locate the Sasquatch's summer areas of residence. There is a lot of work to be done in the weeks to come, and although it does look like my schedule will be filling up, I will make time to get out into the field to continue my research, and I want to thank all of you for joining me on the journey. And until next time, I'm Darrin Smith, and I'll see you here at Squatchspot.